Hello, my friends, and welcome to my second installment of my writing and publishing. As I said, I'm not calling them tips because I think the most important thing is your journey and figuring that out, but I guess kind of my writing and publishing tips. Today, I wanted to talk to you about something that I think might be tempting fate, and that I'm almost afraid to say out loud, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and do it anyway. People ask me a lot about how I deal with writer's block. And sometimes I make something up to tell them, but I have to be really honest, I don't get writer's block. And I know that sounds crazy, but I think there's some reasons. I've thought about it a lot about why I don't get writer's block. So I told you guys last time that I don't outline books. And I actually will say, if you're scared of writer's block and that's something that you're really worried about, starting with an outline is probably a great idea. It's probably a really good place to start, because if you hit that like fork in the road or that place where you just feel really stumped and you don't know what's going to happen next in the story, then you have like a little bit of a guide to tell you where to go next and what you're going to do and what that's going to look like. And so it might be a really good place to start if that's something that you're worried about. But I think part of the reason that I don't get writer's block is because I don't write in chronological order. And I know I'm not alone in this. I know there are a lot of writers who do this. And the reason for that is because since I don't outline, and since sometimes I don't really know where a story is taking me, sometimes I don't even really know what the story is when I'm diving in. I mean, sometimes I do in a really basic way. Like, for example, the Summer of Songbirds, I knew that I wanted to have 3 best friends come back together to save the summer camp that changed their lives and their childhood. Now, why 3 best friends? Because 3 is always great. Because there's always like a little bit of conflict when there are 3 people involved. But also, I don't know, I just like writing 3 characters for some reason. But I knew that was like the basic premise of the story. But then there's some books I've written, like Lies and Other Acts of Love, for example, where I didn't know what the story was yet. I didn't know that it was going to be about this family secret and these 5 generations of women. And I got this idea. I was at home in Salisbury, where I'm from, and my dad was the mayor at the time, and he answered the phone like as I was walking in the house for the day. And I can only hear his side of the conversation, and I'm so intrigued about what he is possibly talking about on the phone, because this is a very odd conversation. And he gets off the phone and I'm like, what in the world was that? And he starts laughing and he says, well, I was the judge for a chili cook-off last week, right? A very small southern town kind of thing, a chili cook-off. And he was like, we were raising money for a vocational program at a school. And the woman that had called him wanted to let him know that she didn't know if he knew it, but that the person they had chosen as the winner was actually a professional chef, and she didn't think that was fair, and she had won second place, and she thought that she should win first and that they should rescind the first place prize from the professional chef because it wasn't a level playing field. And I said, okay, well, what was the prize? And I'm, envisioning that it's like money or something. And he was like, it was a ribbon. It was a blue ribbon. The point of the chili cook-off was to raise money for this vocational program at the school. And I just thought that was the funniest thing in the entire world. And so I sat down and I started writing this scene where there's a woman. I put her in a church office. I don't know why. I just felt like this was a good like church office situation. And she answers the phone and this situation plays out. And this woman answering the phone ends up being Annabelle, who is one of my protagonists of Lies and Other Acts of Love. So that all sounds kind of nebulous and crazy. So again, this is not my writing tip, but I do want to say, if that's how your brain works and that's how you write your books, then, that's kind of okay too. But so the reason that I think that keeps me from getting writer's block is because a lot of times in a story, I know what's going to happen later or somewhere else, or there's a scene in this book that is just like in my head, but it's not what comes next. And sometimes I don't know what comes next, and that is terrifying to not know what comes next. In fact, the manuscript that I just finished, that exact thing happened to me. I had written like the first 40,000 words of the book, which is a lot for me to write in a row, honestly. But this was a story that like just kind of took over my brain, and I just knew where we were going. And it was maybe a little more plot heavy than some of my other stories are. I tend to write kind of more character-based stories, but there's a little more plot in this one that kind of kept me moving forward. And I got to about 40,000 words and I was like, I don't know what happens next. I have no idea. But what I did know was what happened in the end. Like I knew, how the probably last third of the book was going to unfold. So I had the first 40,000 words, and then I had the last probably 25,000 words that I knew. It's just, I didn't know what we tend to call the soggy middle. And so it took me a minute, and then I was like, it's okay. This is what you do. And I let myself write that final like 25 or 30,000 words. And once I was finished with that, I knew what needed to happen in the middle to make that work out. And so in my first few books, I did that much, much more than actually I even do now. And I would just write these big chunks of story, and I would put them in what I thought their order was supposed to be. And then I would write what was missing. And I think it just kept me from panicking about what came next, because I was just telling the next part of the story that was what was most interesting to me. So again, I'm not recommending that anyone do this. I'm just saying, no matter what your process is, if you're ever stuck and you're like, I'm having writer's block and I don't know what comes next, that's okay. Maybe you don't know what comes next, but maybe you know what comes next. Or maybe there's something that's been kind of like jumping out at you that you think, oh, I really need to put that like back in the beginning of the story. And maybe when you put that back in the beginning of the story, then it lets you know what happens next. The other thing that I always do, that I started doing, back in those days when my son was a teeny tiny baby, and I would write in these tiny little snippets of time before I had kind of like dedicated writing time during the day, is I always leave myself notes about what comes next. So, a lot of times when you're like in that flow of that story, a lot of us like, you're starting this while you have a job, you're starting it with your kids at home, you're starting it with people doing construction on your house and coming up and asking you questions every 5 minutes, like whatever it is. A lot of times we might be kind of in that flow state, which is when it feels so good to be writing and the story's just kind of pouring out of you. But then like, it's time for carpool. So you have to go. It doesn't matter how in flow state you are, you have to go. And so I always make a habit of writing myself notes about what comes next. I've heard a lot of authors say that they always stop in the middle of a chapter, or like when like something is like kind of, the excitement's kind of rising, or the action's kind of rising, so that they have something to come back to. I honestly don't do that. When I have the time, like in the mornings, I usually try to write between like 8 and 10 or 8 and 11. And I really like to have something kind of finished for the day. Like I like just personally having the idea of like writing that kind of final sentence of that chapter that like ties it up. But I think that's really good advice, is to stop when you're like in the middle of the action, because you can sit down and jump right back into it. But even though I like to kind of have those finished chapters, I try to write myself the note about, what comes next. The other thing that I will say, and this is I think the hardest thing for us just as humans, not as writers, but just as people in the world, when we have a million things going on and there's so many different things pulling at our attention, I've realized that when I'm trying to solve a big problem in a story and it's just not coming to me, like I just don't really know exactly what the next right thing is, sometimes I just have to step away from it and try not to think about it, which is the hardest thing in the world. But I noticed that my most creative thoughts and ideas come to me on those rare occasions when I actually take a step back from the work and I'm not working, I'm not writing, I'm on vacation. It's, maybe it's the holidays or just having a good time, but it's like, there's something about that allows me to kind of have that creative spark. I also think walking is always really good. Just no headphones, nothing, just get outside and walk and try to clear your head. And it's like your brain is working on that problem, even though you're not consciously doing it. And sometimes it can kind of solve it. But worst case scenario, you're totally stuck. You don't know what's next. You can't do it. Nothing's working. Just write something. Just put your characters in a situation. Send them to a party. Send them on a walk. Send them to the beach. Send them on vacation. It might be complete junk that you end up cutting from the book in the end, but that's not what we're really worried about in a first draft. What we're worried about in a first draft is trying to get a beginning, middle, and an end, get a story down on paper. And if you need to take all that out later, fine. It got you where you wanted to go. And I'm a person that spends probably 3 or 4 times longer editing than I do writing. And so if I have to cut some I know going into it that there are going to be some things in a book that I'm going to have to cut, and there are going to be things that I love in a book that I'm going to have to cut. And so I think, no words are ever wasted. They get you where you're supposed to go. And plus, if you cut out whole chapters, you can always use them when you're promoting the book to say, oh, hey, and you can get this special content that I cut out. Okay, well, I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have like some little tip or trick for something that keeps you from getting writer's block, and send me some good vibes that I didn't jinx myself by saying that.